This question from Clive on email. What can we expect from Royal Antwerp's Senne Lammens if he goes to Manchester United? Will he be their first choice goalkeeper?
That is the, I would say, approximately €20 million question, isn't it? Will he be their first choice goalkeeper? Because he's built himself up really well over the last couple of seasons at Antwerp. But the fact is, you're looking at a goalkeeper of promise, a goalkeeper that you can't know whether he's really ready to start for a Premier League team that wants to be in the European places. The problem is at the moment, because there are such huge questions over both Altay and over Andre Onana, the implication is that he is going to be a first-choice goalkeeper, or at least competing to be first-choice goalkeeper. And look, he's got everything that you should have. Decent level of top-level experience. He's big, which Premier League clubs really like now, can command his box. But what if it doesn't start well? Like the thing that would concern me if I was Lammens is this the club where I'm going to develop into the player where I should now? And if I arrive and it doesn't go well immediately, is there going to be an unrealistic and unreasonable amount of pressure on me that is going to be very difficult to get out from under, as if I was Xerxes or Højlund or any of these other players who cost a lot of money and weren't able to turn into what they were? I think it's a leap of faith to trust Manchester United with the next couple of years of your career as a big young talent these days.
Would you trust them, JJ? Would you trust, if you were Senne Lammens, would you trust Manchester United with your career in that way?
I wouldn't necessarily jump into it, no. But also I think there's an element of consideration that United are maybe overlooking at this moment in time as well. Is, Andy's sort of asking the question, from Lammens' perspective, what if it doesn't work out? But also from United's perspective, what if the pressure, what if the expectation is too much and indeed it doesn't start off well? Then suddenly you're back to the current situation where sort of Onana is considered the default number one, and the situation hasn't really changed. Now, I appreciate that with no continental football, it's difficult for United to really go out into the market for arguably sort of the best profile of goalkeeper available at the moment, i.e., sort of a Gianluigi Donnarumma at PSG. But it does really feel like United have experimented with this kind of profile of players, and Andy mentioned a couple earlier, like Xerxes, like Højlund, and it hasn't really worked out. I mean, even somebody like Euro, who looked totally assured, and I know that he had injury problems at the beginning, who looked totally assured when he was playing in Ligue 1, has really sort of struggled, to justify the price tag that United put on him at this moment in time. So I feel that as much as there is a risk on the players' part, there's also a risk on the clubs as well, because it feels like the bigger issue in terms of the goalkeeper position is not just sort of potentially who's starting, but it's actually the hierarchy of the players itself. I think you almost need to do a proper reset of the starting goalkeeper, the substitute, and also sort of the reserve, the backup, the third option.
The only way in which this signing makes sense is if you're signing him as second choice to challenge for first. So, for example, if say you're forgetting Altay for a minute, say that's the way you're going to go, and Lammens replaces him as second choice goalkeeper, and you're going to start Onana and then have Lammens challenge him, maybe that is the way to go. Because the other aspect of this, if you're buying another first choice goalkeeper, you're creating another expensive, unsellable player in Andre Onana, because you're basically saying to the world, this goalkeeper that Inter signed for nothing, that we bought for 50 million a year later, is essentially worth nothing now. And he's on a big contract. How are you going to sell him? How are you going to get anything back for him? That is the difficulty here. So if that's the approach in signing Lammens, in that he's the second choice goalkeeper challenging Onana for top spot, maybe that brings a bit more out of Onana. This is your best case scenario. Maybe it brings more out of Onana. And maybe that is the way to, A, reinflate Onana's value. Because I think even if he's having a difficult time there is an argument to stick with him, I would suggest, because he's not a terrible goalkeeper. He's just having a bad time. And secondly, you can develop this new guy at a bit more of a reasonable pace. And all that stuff that will happen to him in the first month, like he will drop across and concede a goal because it's the Premier League and because it's something to get used to. Unless he's 1 in a million, he's going to have to go through those things to get there, rather than that being something that becomes an unbearable weight for him that he can't shift. If Onana's there to share the burden, and maybe it's not something that stays in people's minds forever, and maybe he still gets to develop.
What about this question from Katie on Instagram? After both Celtic and Rangers were embarrassed in their Champions League qualifiers, what does this say about the current state of second and indeed third-tier leagues across Europe? JJ?
Yeah, I mean, I think it embarrassing is the right word. I think that's the word that Russell Martin used to describe Rangers showing against Club Brugge over 2 legs. I think there are 2 ways to look at it. I mean, I think there is competing, and I think there's, being absolutely sort of blown out of the water, and, Rangers, were absolutely devastated by Brugge, and to think really that both Celtic and Brugge, were competing in the Champions League last season. Okay, I'm not sort of drawing a direct comparison between Rangers and Celtic, but sort of having the potential to have 2 Scottish representatives in the Champions League phase and having both of them drop down to the Europa League. I think that's indicative that, some of these kind of leagues just outside of the top 5 leagues in Europe have clubs that are now better placed to compete than Scotland does through either Rangers or Celtic. I think Celtic, given that they were in the league phase last season, that is disappointing, and obviously it's a big blow, not just for Scottish football, but for the clubs financially as well, because I think it cost them both, round about at least 20 million not making it into the league phase, just to put a rough sort of ballpark financial figure on it. So, I do think that this is worrying for sort of Scottish football at this moment in time on the continental stage. I mean, looking at things, sort of the glass half full, I guess you could make an argument that Rangers in the last couple of years, certainly the year that they went to the final, have already sort of provided an argument that it's maybe more befitting for them at the moment, the Europa League level than the Champions League level. But equally, I think to have both of them dropping out and not have one team in the Champions League and one team in the Europa League is hugely detrimental, because there are other sort of leagues outside of the top 5 leagues who have learned to use the hierarchy within the European competitions to, try and grow success from the Conference League through the Europa League up into competing in the Champions League. But then you also look at some of the other, sort of relative European minnows as well. I mean, look at the fantastic story of Glimt the last couple of years. The fact that they're now going to be competing in the Champions League. Sure, it's wonderful for Norwegian football and for for the region, but also for the other leagues kind of losing out. In this case, Scottish football. It's hugely deflating and detrimental, and to have that double blow, not just one team, but both dropping out and really, dropping out to ridicule in Rangers' case. I think it is hugely worrying and suggests that there is now, this gap opening up, between some of the Scottish clubs and some of the other sort of forward-thinking teams who are learning to compete despite not having, the sort of financial prowess that the clubs from the top 5 leagues have.
I mean, obviously, Rangers are in a really bad place at the moment, and we have to put that in this context. And in the state they're in, I think drawing Club Brugge is really unfortunate, because Brugge are experienced achievers in the groups and the knockouts in the Champions League in recent years. They've got better players than Rangers anyway, and that they have better experienced players, much better experienced players. When you look at Michele and Vanaken and players like that, I think Celtics is almost a little bit more of a disappointment. Obviously, there's not the same scale of humiliation, I suppose, but the fact that Celtic are huge favourites in that they let it get all the way to a penalty shootout. But if you go back a couple of years, the Scottish champions have to get through several qualifying rounds to get there. And this time they only had one qualifying round against the team that they would fancy themselves against. And that they managed to not really take control of the tie. That's very disappointing. But I think as well, we do have to contextualise this across a number of seasons. I think in the immediate aftermath of the disappointment, it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This happened to the Turkish Super League last season. Galatasaray, after having spent a ton in the transfer market, which Celtic haven't, which is obviously a big topic of discussion up there at the moment, they went out in the playoff round to young boys. So both Galatasaray and Fenerbahce had to start in the lower competition, which was tough for them. And obviously Galatasaray got back into it last season, and Fenerbahce were unable to. All I'm saying is the Scottish Premiership is not alone in this. And I think, you've seen Fenerbahce again missing the cut for the Champions League, losing to Benfica in the playoffs, despite, again, having spent a fortune on transfers and new wages this summer, and, having a coach who gets a lot of wages, I think it's fair to say, in Jose Mourinho. I guess the consolation, even if you're looking at the fact that missing out on that Champions League money is a huge deal, because, as I was saying elsewhere, with Bodo Glimt, for example, as JJ mentioned, with what they are going to gain from this season of the Champions League, the first Norwegian team to make it in there in 18 years, they should really dominate Norwegian football for the next decade, because it's an absolutely unbelievable amount of money, especially with the expanded format. But the advantage for Celtic and Rangers, and especially as JJ was saying, Rangers have been very, very competitive in the Europa League for a number of years. This is actually putting them in a position when maybe the next champions of Scotland, which at the moment we have to presume Celtic, go a couple of years down the line, maybe they don't even have to go into the playoff round. Maybe they'll directly qualify, because essentially the coefficient points pile up from getting results in the Europa League, from getting results in the Conference League, not just in getting results in the Champions League. And if you look at some of those second and third tier leagues that have managed to do better in recent years, and you look at the fact that Galatasaray didn't have to go into a playoff this year, they're directly in the group stage as the champions of Turkey, that is because of the advances that they, and especially Fenerbahce, have made in the Conference League and the Europa League. You look at the Dutch teams who've done so well in the Conference League in recent years. It all counts.
A question from Jack on email. Could you see a more competitive Eredivisie than recent seasons? So another existential question for our man in France. Eredivisie?
I definitely think, there is, potential for it to be a little bit more competitive. But I think maybe, we're sort of looking at it sort of through the wrong prism, because I think if you look, and it sort of touches on the last question that we were discussing, and we mentioned sort of the success of the Dutch league on, the continental stage. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's such a bad thing, for there to be a bit of variety at the top of the Eredivisie. I don't think it's by chance that sort of with, Feyenoord and PSV, being able to sort of compete more regularly with Ajax, who had, a brilliantly dominant spell, a few years ago. And then when that great team was broken up, they really struggled to follow it up for a long period of time. I think not having sort of Ajax, completely romping away at the top and having more of a three-horse kind of race, so to speak, I think it does make the Eredivisie a more exciting competition. But I think you're also seeing the benefits of that in Europe as well, because, in the years that the Feyenoord and PSV are able to sort of hold their own and fend Ajax off for the title, they're able to bring in better players that enable them to compete more, whether that's in the Conference League, whether that's in the Europa League, or whether that's stepping it up into the Champions League as well. And I think that has been hugely beneficial for Dutch football overall in the last couple of years. And I think, it's a state of normality, really, especially for Ajax to be always selling their best, most talented players. Sure, there have been sort of heavier summer and winter transfer windows where they've lost more talent than they would do normally, but selling at least one or two key pieces, per transfer window, was always the norm for Ajax, as they kind of, kept, a grip on, their domestic supremacy while also being able to still compete, to an extent in Europe. And the fact that, Ajax kind of completely fell away when their squad was picked apart a couple of years ago, I think that really opened the door to Feyenoord and PSV to make not only, the Eredivisie title race more interesting, but also Dutch involvement on the continental scene more interesting as well.
I think that's the thing, really, isn't it? It was one thing to get the opportunity, and it's another to take it. And PSV and Feyenoord in recent years, particularly PSV under Peter Bosz. Yeah, that's right. We're going to praise Peter Bosz again. They've done a really good job in taking that on. For me, PSV are clear favourites again this season. They appear to have recruited well despite losing Malik Tillman as well. Ruben van Bommel, yeah, that's right. Mark's son had a brilliant start to the season. Very dynamic, very exciting player. PSV are very, very watchable, which, funnily enough, Ajax haven't been for a while. They're a really tough watch under Fadioli last season. It feels like that's gradually evolving under John Heitinger. But the stodgy first couple of games of the season, I thought they were good last weekend against Heracles. But Feyenoord are interesting because I just feel that Feyenoord have come quite a way under Robin van Persie, and it felt to me like they were taking a total flyer appointing him because he had very little experience at Heerenveen.
We talked about it at the time, didn't we?
We did, and we said it was a bit of a leap of faith. But maybe it's one of those places he just belongs there. He's done very, very well since he arrived. They've been good to watch. They've made good progress. Of course, as JJ says, they're still... We say this a couple of days ahead of the transfer window, so they're vulnerable to a certain extent, and they did lose David Hansko, of course, this summer as well, which is tough. For me, PSV the favourites, but if Feyenoord can make it at least a race for some of the season, that would be impressive. For Ajax, I feel it's very much wait and see because there's nowhere near the depth of talent that there has been in recent years.
This from Stephen on X. Given Marseille's impressive victory against Paris FC, how effective is Roberto De Zerbi's player management in light of the dressing room incident in their last game, which we covered at some length in last week's OTC? However, Jonathan, how do you think Marseille's impressive victory will affect not just Roberto De Zerbi but the team?
Well, I think the goings on at Marseille have taken an interesting turn. Obviously, since that bust up in losing the opening game 1-0 to 10-man Rennes, they bounced back on the pitch, as you mentioned, with I'd say a stirring victory in terms of the scoreline, but it briefly flirted with disaster as well, sort of having gone 2-0 up and then sort of being pegged back to 2-2 when Paris FC actually could have found themselves in the lead as well. But I think ultimately, De Zerbi and the club hierarchy took the right action after the incident between Rabiot and Rowe. I think obviously Rowe has moved on since to Bologna. Rabiot at this moment in time, it's kind of up in the air what gets decided next. De Zerbi has already started to sort of pave the way for his potential return, which I think with an eye towards the Champions League and the experience that Rabiot brings, I can understand that. But equally, I could understand if the club hierarchy say no, there's going to be no reintegration of Rabiot because, his previous behaviour was unacceptable. Obviously, Rabiot's mum, Veronique, has had her say on the issue as well, which hasn't helped matters. But I think De Zerbi, was able to get the squad to focus on what was happening on the pitch. And it was nice to see as well a veteran, Aubameyang, chip in with a couple of goals. Nicely taken ones as well. They weren't sort of easy finishes. And I think... Marseille now, after a bit of a false start, will be looking to try and make back as much of the ground as possible between them and PSG, because there is, the possibility that PSG's slow start to the season is prolonged. We'll have to see, how long those sort of heavy legs last because of the lack of pre-season. But as long as they can sort of keep PSG within reach, the first Classique, is not that far away. And I think there is an opportunity perhaps for Marseille to compete a little bit more meaningfully this year, in terms of the title. But ultimately, the club is absolutely going to have to either back Roberto De Zerbi and his man management methods, or they are going to have to take a hardline stance and make sure that Roberto De Zerbi is understanding of that. And it seems like whatever the outcome of the Rabiot question, I guess, so to speak, whatever the outcome of that is, that could potentially, sort of dictate what follows, this season and how competitive Marseille are able to be, not just in Ligue 1, but also in Europe as well.
I think that's the interesting thing for me. Not how De Zerbi responds not just to this, but to the pressure of a very busy calendar. Because we've seen him struggle with that a little bit before, in an environment in Marseille which is, I think, tense at the best of times as well. That's a question. But JJ's mention of Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, I think, is really interesting. Not just his goals in this, but his whole demeanour. He's someone who really lifts a place. He's someone who's got the personality to be able to deal with playing for a club like that, and that's why he's come back for more from Saudi. I think he missed it. It seems like he missed it. And Aubameyang, he's a fascinating character and a fascinating player, because as a player, he's, I think, improved in his 30s. He's so smart, I think, and he does a better all-round job for the team, and it has done at Marseille and Barcelona, than he ever did at Dortmund or Arsenal when he was in his supposed prime, even if he was rated more as a top-level European goalscorer now. He still scores goals at reasonable level. I think he contributes to the team. And in terms of his personality, there was a great moment when they interviewed him as he came off the pitch, and obviously it's been super tense in the light of the Rabiot row bust-up. De Zerbi gives a very stern press conference. Longoria, the president, and Benatia, the sporting director, likewise. And Aubameyang, he's just got that smile that takes over his whole face.
Always.
And he goes, well, it's just another crazy week in Marseille, isn't it? No one else in the squad can get away with that. No one else in the squad can get away with that. And he just laughs. And all of a sudden you feel a little less tense. And he's just, let's get out there. Let's play some football. Let's score some goals and make the people happy. And I think that's great. I think the effect of that is underrated.
That's what it's like when you live in the dream. Liam on email says, what can we expect from Hamburg versus St. Pauli in the Hamburg derby this weekend? I outed you on OTC this weekend as being not a St. Pauli ultra, but of being embedded with them at some point.
They haven't let me handle any of the pyro yet. I'm building up to it. Certainly not this game, because it's at the Volkspark Stadion, which is Huisvouw's stadium. Well, we're going to find out, aren't we? I think this is going to be a fascinating derby, because obviously Hamburg are the much bigger club. St. Pauli are probably the bigger international name, because in terms of like marketing their counterculturalism, they're very well known for what they are all over Europe. And now that you've got the Hamburg derby back in the top division, it's fascinating for two reasons. Firstly, because St. Pauli really had the hex on them last time they were playing each other in the Bundesliga 2. And so if you look at recent encounters, St. Pauli kind of made Hamburg their bunnies. And secondly, even though Hamburg are the bigger club, St. Pauli are starting a second straight season in the Bundesliga. Huisvouw are up for the first time after 7 years away. And so they've sort of, even though they're different sizes of clubs, and traditionally with very different means, they've got very similar aims this season, just to stay in the division. So I think that this adds a really interesting edge to it, especially when you've got this minor role reversal of St. Pauli being the more established team. Now, look, I think Hasval did great on the first weekend of the season. They went to Mönchengladbach, who are in a bit of a state of flux at the moment, got themselves a draw. We're always talking about how difficult it is, JJ, for the promoted teams coming up into Europe's top divisions. Hamburg and Köln, 4 points between them last week and didn't concede a goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you touched on a really pertinent point as well with the fact that St. Pauli is starting a second consecutive season in the top flight. I think that does kind of put them at a bit of an advantage, especially when you bear in mind that, their tails are going to be up as well from, coming back late on against Dortmund last week. It does kind of feel like there's a little bit of momentum there now. So, that might offset kind of home advantage for HSV. But it does, I think, there's always an element of intrigue when you're looking at the clubs that are coming up to the Bundesliga each season at the moment, because there's just so many big names down there dwelling in the second tier in Germany. Their sort of return to their sort of rightful place, or their sort of historic level within the German game has always fascinated me. So to see how sort of HSV in particular, because Köln are a bit more of a yo-yo team, seeing how they acquit themselves in terms of making sure that they stay in the Bundesliga this year and don't immediately drop back down to the second tier. We know how difficult it was for them to get out of the second tier, to begin with. So to drop down immediately again after a season would be a huge disappointment. But I think that's going to make these two Hamburg derby encounters really, really interesting this season, because they are essentially relegation 6-pointers, and I think you would probably give St. Pauli the slight edge at this moment in time. Obviously going to be a feisty encounter on the pitch regardless, but you also mentioned something really interesting at the beginning in the way that sort of St. Pauli have been able to position themselves in terms of their image really well over the last few years, at a time when Hamburg have really been struggling down in the second tier, sort of their previous kind of historic image being sort of sullied by the fact that they've continually been a little bit of a laughing stock at times, because they were almost too big for the second tier, and obviously such a historic figure in German football. So this is definitely going to be one of the games to watch this weekend, and one that I think could have potentially quite a big impact on ultimately who stays up and goes down come the end of the season.
Talking of the games to watch this weekend, it is that time again when we ask both of you to identify a game of the week for us to enjoy. Each week, our experts recommend a game for you to watch at the weekend or during the weekend. Just as importantly, they also suggest the food that you should be having with it, and not just at half time. Start eating from kickoff. JJ, what? What? You always laugh when I mention what I want to do.
Spectators, not players.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to clarify.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for that clarification. JJ, what are you going for as your game of the week this week?
Well, for me, it's the Olympico in France, as it's kind of known, between Olympique Lyonnais and Olympique de Marseille. So huge game. I think one that could potentially have quite big ramifications already, even this early in the season, given that Marseille have dropped points already, and Lyon look fairly decent, fairly solid, despite the fact that they've obviously had to sell and probably, presumably, will still sell somebody else before the transfer window closes as well. But I think it's shaping up to be a fascinating start to life on the pitch. Was really encouraged by what I saw last week by Lyon, and obviously we've already spoken about how Marseille recovered from a disappointing first game of the season. But I think this one for me feels like a key match really for OM to try and win, or at least make sure that they don't lose if they're ambition is to remain as close to the chasing pack as possible, certainly before, European games come into play. So I think I'll be watching that one definitely. And what I would pair it with in terms of the grub, I, for whatever reason, feeling very in the mood for some smoked duck, which is very, very famous, not that far from Lyon. I'm not going to say it's a Lyon-based specialty, but sort of in the mountain regions, sort of having a smoked duck kind of salad with a side bowl of Lyonnaise potatoes, I suppose, and a nice glass of Côte de Rhône to wash it down would be most welcome.
Could have gone.
He's brought out the big guns, hasn't he?
He has, yeah. Well, that's on Sunday at 7:45, and I know you're going to be watching that, Andy. You will definitely be watching that. I would have gone for the smoked haddock, Marseille style. But hey, It's duck, and duck it is. However, you've got a pick for us as our game of the week.
Yeah, so by the time of JJ's game, we'll have already watched mine, Girona versus Sevilla, on Saturday at 6:30 p.m. UK. We're lucky that it is in Girona and not in Sevilla, Dotun, because if it was in Sevilla, of course, the heat at sort of 7:30 p.m. local time at this time of year is probably too oppressive to really eat anything of any substance. So we're pleased that it's in Girona from the off. But this is a huge game already because you're looking at two teams who we're used to seeing in the upper part of the table or in Europe, certainly with Sevilla, of course, serial European trophy winners. Girona in the Champions League last season, and they had some decent moments in it, pushing PSG all of the way, making life difficult for Liverpool, albeit in one of the latter games. And they're both in a real mess now. Now, Girona have lost their first two games of the season. They've conceded 8 goals in those 2 games. And when they lost 5-0 at Villarreal last Sunday, I mean, firstly, they were absolutely awful. Secondly, Michel, their coach, had a bit of a meltdown in the press conference, and he talked about how they were 4-0 down when they were 4-0 down at half time. He just didn't know what to say to the players because they were failing on so many basic levels. It didn't feel as if there was anything he could do. Now, they've lost quite a few big players this summer and last summer. Squad doesn't really look good enough. If they want to stay in the division, I think they're going to have to call on those Manchester City connections to lend them more than just Victor Reis, who went across there to play at centre-back this summer, is probably regretting going there already. And then you look at Sevilla, who you think of an institution of Spanish football. They're in a right old mess. They lost at home to Getafe, who alternatively have had a great start to the season, winning both their away games and both their games so far. Sevilla just lost their best defender, Loic Bade, who's gone to Leverkusen, as JJ was saying in the main pod yesterday. The players they've signed, they're in a sort of Barcelona light formation in that they haven't been able to register them. For the good news is that Gabriel Suazo and Alfon have both been registered for this weekend. Flakodimos has still not been registered yet. They don't have the financial latitude to do that. So already this is a huge game. It feels as if at best ridicule, at worst sporting disaster for the loser here. So look, let's not think about it too hard. We've got too much other stuff to worry about. Let's stick to some nice, simple tapas. We're going to go to make us feel it's still holiday. We're going to go 3 hours south, get a few dishes of Valencian paella. That's the one with the chicken in it as
rabbit,
well.
Isn't it?
Which
the Valencia one?
No, you can have chicken as well. Rabbit is a possibility.
I'm not
you,
for the rabbit.
You can have chicken. Well, okay, let's go with chicken for you then.
Thank you.
And but what we're going to do is we're going to keep it strictly Catalan for the patatas bravas, of course, because we don't want any Tommy K on them like they have in Valencia. Let's stay well away from that region when it comes to the sauce. Bit of pimientos de padrón, of course, for our 5 a day. And look, we'll have a great time with the food, even if the football's really tense. How can it be tense 3 games into the season?
I'm looking forward to that. I think it's a cracking game. Girona versus Sevilla at 6:30 on Saturday, as Andy told us. And don't forget, Lyon versus Marseille, following day at 7:45 p.m. And Andy and JJ will be reacting to the Lyon versus Marseille game on Monday on OTC Reacts. That is it from us for this edition. Thank you for listening to Ask OTC. If you'd like to ask a question, you can contact us at any time at Radio Dotun, at Andy Brassel, or at John_LeGossip. You can email us otc@footballramble.com.